call the meeting to order. Welcome to the regular meeting of the Brisbane Planning Commission, Tuesday, April 10th, 2018. Could we have a roll call, please?
Commissioner Gomez?
Here.
Commissioner Gooding?
Here.
Mike, there we go.
Here.
Commissioner Mackin?
Here.
Commissioner Patel?
Here.
Commissioner Saison?
Here. Records show that all commissioners are present. And then the first item we have is adoption of the agenda. Could we have a motion to adopt the agenda, please?
I make a motion that we adopt the agenda.
And a second?
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? No, the motion passes. First item is consent calendar. Would anyone like to pull any item from the consent calendar? None, I see none. Okay, could we have a motion to adopt the consent calendar?
I'll make a motion to adopt the calendar.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Motion carries. First item, oral communications. I see no one wishing to speak, so we'll move on. Written communications. We have one item from the Bay Area Monitor publication, the League of Women Voters of the Bay Area. It's their publication, April-May 2018. Moving on, new business. First item on tonight's agenda. We have a public hearing, continuance of a public hearing requested for use permit UP 9-17 for 273A Valley Drive. That's a TC1 Crocker Park Trade Commercial District and a 6,000 square foot cannabis business.
Point of order, Madam Chairman?
Yes.
You already approved the continuance for that under the consent calendar, so there's
Oh,
no need
thank
to take
you.
a separate
Thank you very
action.
much. You're
Sure.
correct. Okay. Then moving right along. New business. Tonight, we actually have no new business on this agenda. So items initiated by staff is a review of Planning Commission rules and procedures.
Great, thank you very much. You had in your packet this evening a clean set of recommended new rules and procedures. The previous adopted version and then a red line strikeout or track changes version. We found that to be somewhat complicated. So for purposes, I think, of just going through this, I'm going to suggest I just kind of walk it through very quickly, section by section, and then anybody has any comments or questions, we kind of just do it in one sort of linear process, if that's okay with the commission.
Are you all right with us stopping you as we
Yes,
go
that would be my goal. So I would literally go section by section. Again, just by background, these rules haven't really been adopted or looked at in their totality since 2002. There have been a lot of changes, both procedural changes. The council's made certain changes in how they want their boards and commissions to operate. And then there are also just practical issues based on technology changes that really weren't reflected in the rules. So we thought it was really appropriate time, especially with the new commission, to take a fresh start at this. So with that, again, I'm using then what was attachment 1 of your packet as the basis. So we added a new section A of governing procedures, just kind of to give an overview or a summary of what the purpose of the rules are. That's a new section that wasn't in the previous rules. So if anybody had any comments, questions on section A, governing procedures, I entertain them now.
I have one.
Mhm.
The final word in the sentence, City Council's rules and procedures shall control. The word control seemed just odd. I would suggest prevail.
Sure.
Anyone else? Okay, continue.
Okay. Section B, which relates to meeting time and place. Again, these are just minor changes to reflect actual procedure. Just recently, we did amend the rules to move from Thursday meetings to Tuesday meetings. That was done, I think, over last summer, maybe. But there weren't a lot of major changes to this particular section. That would be B1, 2, and 3. So if anybody had any questions or comments on section B, or if anyone wants me to explain anything in more detail, I'd be glad to do it, but otherwise I don't feel the need to read this document to you.
I'll start with one more.
Sure.
Under number 1, regular meetings, the second sentence, when the day for any regular meeting of the commission falls on a legal holiday, comma, no meeting shall be held on such holiday. I would put a period there because it becomes confusing with the word but. I would remove the word but and just start the next sentence, capital T, the regular meeting.
Sure.
Anyone else? No? Okay.
Okay, section C relates to the selection of officers and their term of office. We did make one, I would consider a substantive change, but it was more a change based on the council's calendar and schedule. Previously, the election of officers has been held in February. Just in the last several cycles of appointments, those appointments haven't been done until late January, early February. We've had to carry over the appointment, so we just moved it to March to give the council a little more time to go through their appointment process of commissioners when they're up. So that was the only what I'd consider a substantive change from before. Also, I would make one suggested change. I noticed this didn't get picked up in the last sentence on page 2. Under right above subsection 2, the paragraph that starts, if the position of chairperson becomes vacant, the vice chair shall assume the duties for the remainder of the official term. I would strike that last sentence after that. That was a missed edit.
Also,
Oh, I'm sorry. No, you're right. We'll keep that. It was the vice chairman, not the chairperson. No, never mind. Julia's corrected me. She'll often do that, which is very helpful for all parties involved. Thanks, Julia. Good catch.
So could you restate what you want there?
There will be no changes.
Oh, no
I've
changes
been,
at
I've
all.
been corrected. Rightly so. Okay.
I have one little tiny one, if I may, Madam
Sure.
Chair.
Yes.
In the, toward the top of page 3 in the during meeting section, it's just a grammar issue about staying consistent. The second bullet point that starts may establish time limits. The may is kind of extra. It's already up in the previous paragraph. All the other bullet points are, just the verb infinitive, and so it sounds like it's saying, may do the following, may establish time limits. I think if it just starts establish time limits, it'll be just consistent grammatically with the rest of them. Does that make sense?
I got it.
Okay, you got it.
He's saying to be demonstrative,
That's where the previous may is.
since the other statements are.
Right.
I guess the only difference between time limits tend to be, it is something that's discretionary on the part of the chairperson. That's, as long as that's clear, the chair isn't obligated to set time limits. That's the only value of may or not. But I wouldn't want, as long as the chair is aware of that, I wouldn't want it to be presumed that yes, he or she is obligated to establish. It's a
Right.
permissive, not
Yeah.
required.
You could also just reword it and say,
Establish time limits.
establish time limits.
May I suggest?
As appropriate or something?
Right, at the
As-
chairperson's
right.
discretion.
There you go.
Yeah, I like that.
Anyone else? No? Okay.
So again, section D, which Commissioner Gooding was getting into, is responsibilities of chair and vice chair. Again, there's just some minor clarification to reflect current procedures. That bleeds over onto page 3 of this document, in terms of both the chair's responsibilities during the meeting and outside the meeting. And then the next section is section E, the conduct of the meetings. Again, that's more, changes were made to reflect the reality of how we do business. So I'd entertain any questions or comments on the responsibilities of the chair and vice chair, or the meeting conduct. So pages 2 through 4.
I do have a question, just as a clarification, and I think I know the answer, but under quorum, if there were only 3 commissioners left on the commission, would 2 legitimately be considered a quorum? Okay. Yes.
Except for general plan amendments, which I think is stated in there, but.
Yeah, that's
Right.
already in there.
Okay. Anyone else?
Are you on the conduct of hearings yet, or do you want to? If you are, I had one question really, and it's just for my own curiosity, being new. In section C of the conduct of hearings, so it's in the red line section, it's in the middle of page 6, where the applicant or applicant's representative may have no more than 10 minutes to address the commission. I was just curious if that's established precedent, or if that's consistent with prior rules, or sort of where that comes from.
That's a really good question, in that we've had applicants go on for 30 minutes.
I mean, I suspect it's a good idea to have a kind of a default limit. Just wondering if it comes from some place that's defensible, that we can say that's where we got it from, or that's why we do it this way. It would be helpful. I confess ignorance, I don't know.
And are the applicants notified of a time limit before they come to a meeting if they're going to make any kind of presentation?
Typically, the applicant will be in contact with staff, and they'll indicate how long they think they're going to take. And I think it's by practice, something like the Baylands, for example, we'd expect to be more than 10 minutes, obviously. There's always going to be the exception to the rule. I think but our experience is that for kind of the typical applications that you see, the 80% rule, that's 10 minutes will be satisfactory. And so we're kind of having some guidelines, and again, these are not requirements per se, it's sort of a generally, and so we kind of give them that as a starting point. If they need more, then that gives us kind of a bit of a conversation start with them if they really do need more time. But even again, it's up to your discretion. You can either strike it from here, or you can, deal with it on a case-by-case basis. It's your discretion.
Thank you for that clarification. Anyone else on that section? Okay, we can move on.
So again, you're in the part with is just basically how the meeting is conducted, and it's, again, just to provide a little more description, a little more elaboration on how we conduct our meetings typically. So I don't really have anything to add, but I'll entertain any other questions you might have on this section.
No questions? No, we can move along. This is a testament to what a good job you did.
That, or how interesting the subject matter is, how you want to look at it, I guess.
Oh, this was riveting, really.
Oh, it was well done.
From an attorney, I don't know if that's complimentary or not, but okay. So I am in my list here. I'm on page 7, points of order, motions, calling for the questions, and voting. So that's 7 through 12. If anybody has any comments, questions, any of those segments.
Anyone? Going once? Going twice? No? Nothing.
Okay, moving on to abstentions. I think this has been an issue that for prior commissioners and commissions sometimes is an issue in terms of when you should abstain versus, what are your obligations in terms of voting. And again, if you have questions on these kind of issues, it's always worth, I'd encourage you to always contact the city attorney on those kind of issues. The normal situation here, the expectation is that unless you have a true conflict and you're disqualified, that we'd expect commissioners to take a position on an issue that's before them, if they're eligible to take that vote, whether it's a no vote or a yes, no, but that we really do encourage commissioners to take a position, not just to abstain from the decision. So again, that's something that's come up previously. The conflict of interest, this is very short and to the point. In your binders, in your commission, the books we gave you in terms of your guidebooks, there's a lot more information in terms of the separation and distance when you're presumed to have a economic conflict or conflict due to economics. Properties within X many feet of your residence, typically within 500 feet of property you own in Brisbane, will consider you disqualified from acting because of potential conflict. We provide a map, if you haven't already received one from staff, that shows, based on our knowledge of your property ownership in town, those properties where you would be conflicted out. And then when a case comes up, we routinely check that, and we will provide that information to you on a as-needed basis when it comes up. So moving on, then we have the minutes, and again, that is just a matter of current practice. And the last couple things are, one is the committees. We formalized, because the commission as a whole has on many or several occasions decided to form a subcommittee, whether it's an ad hoc subcommittee to deal with individual issues. And so that was just kind of to provide some clarification, because the rules were fairly silent on that before. And then lastly, the performance of commissioners is all really kind of governed by the council. You do serve at the council's pleasure, and they have rules in terms of how they operate and choose to appoint or remove commissioners and attendance and other issues that they've set by policy. So this is just kind of reflecting that. So that is my short version of the rules.
Any other?
Just a quick question around subcommittees. Like, are there any particular, when we kind of look at the calendar year 2018, are there any kind of topical items that would require additional, let's just say, research, right? That would merit doing something now versus kind of down the line? And this is more of just a general kind of curiosity question, or is that something we would look for direction from council or staff to research a given topical area and therefore have a subcommittee? Or is it more there's an application and it has some intangible, issues that we need to dig through, and that would require the subcommittee? Like, I'm just trying to understand.
Typically, the subcommittee is going to be an issue-based, maybe the council's giving you direction to look at some particular provision of the code.
Okay.
And maybe it's fairly research intensive, and instead of maybe having meetings at the full commission level that are getting into some high level of detail and time, there may be the desire, you have a couple commissioners who have the interest and the time to devote to that particular topic, they would appoint a subcommittee to deal with those particular issues. They would typically coordinate with staff then that work product and the work program, and then the subcommittee would report back to the commission as a whole. But it really is a creature of the commission. I wouldn't ever expect it to be an issue of a development application in front of you, because then you really can't be having meetings of a minority regarding an item that's before you as a public hearing. So
Right.
typically,
that was really the heart of my
Yeah.
question, is like, what would merit forming a subcommittee? Because it kind of seems almost counterintuitive, but just
yeah, it would be more, I think, things that are code-based or policy. If the commission thinks there's the need for the council to delve into a particular planning policy issue, maybe they appoint a subcommittee to do a little more research and flesh out what that recommendation might be to the council, for example. A risk being that if the council doesn't take that policy suggestion or direction, that time of the commissioners is may or may not result in some final action by the council. But
okay, good, thank you.
sure.
Anyone else? Making,
It's maybe a little bit too picky, but on page 5, can we change the word, the planning commission, page 5, number 7, where it says the conduct of the public hearing shall generally be as follows to just will generally be followed. The reason why is, I don't know, whenever we do statutory interpretation, the shall typically means it has to be followed, and if the things that are following it are not something that we have to follow, then it makes a difference.
Anyone else? More details? Commissioner Gooding, you look like you're thinking.
Well, another question about the timing issues, back on paragraph, what is that? Paragraph 8 of E, it's in the red line, it's in page 8 of the red lines, I'm not sure where it is in the final, about oral communications. And we currently say the total time allotted for oral communications shall not exceed 15 minutes. Do we want to put in any sort of discretion for the chair to extend it if necessary, or it sounds like it 50 minutes we have to, cut off everybody no matter what the issue. It is extra oral communication. It's stuff that's extra that's not on the agenda. I recognize that, but is it prudent to put in some sort of you can allow more if the chair wants to?
Yeah, I guess you always could. I mean, in the 12 years I've been here now, I've never seen that particular part of the agenda ever exceed more than 15 minutes.
This doesn't happen?
So it has not been an
I figured it probably
issue.
wouldn't.
Normally, the time is on items that are agendized. And,
Yeah.
But that's, again, these are all at the commission's discretion, so you could certainly add that sort of language if you feel the need. I have no objection to it.
Anyone else?
I just have a procedural question. If someone goes over the time limit, I mean, who's timing people that are talking, and who cuts them off, and what is that procedure?
Oh, we have a timer. There's a little that if we chose to use it, and we did use that on cases where we were being fairly rigorous with time. The chair, I mean, if someone was clearly going over an established time limit, we would use the timer if it's going to be prescribed. If it's something that just is running on, the staff would probably make a point of order to the chair that something's happened. It's ultimately up to the chair to run the meeting, and the chair can have discretion to extend time limits or do what have you. And obviously we're not in the business here of pulling people away from the dais or cutting off their microphone or anything, but just through gentle persuasion and respect for their commission's time and their peers and the public, that we expect people to follow whatever rules of decorum and procedure that the commission chooses to establish.
So if there was a situation, let's say someone is speaking and a commissioner wanted to extend time for that person, could the commissioner make a motion, and if it was seconded and agreed upon, we could do that?
Yeah, I know you may not even need to, you could just do it sort of by consent of everybody. I guess if it was an issue of contention, yeah, you could vote on it. But if, again, if the commission as a whole wants to extend the courtesy to that courtesy, you reserve the right to do that. Obviously, you get into equity issues if you have 12 people speaking and you give person 7 extra time for whatever reason. You will probably hear about it later if person 9 feels compelled to extend beyond their time limit. So those are all decisions you would make kind of on the fly at a given circumstance.
Just kind of to segue what you were saying, one of the areas where it can be a little bit sticky is where the public hearing's closed and then members of the public want to come back and talk again. And if you allow one, then the others want to talk, and it just snowballs.
Okay.
Commissioner Patel,
No, I'm good.
you look like you had something to say.
I have every confidence that you will keep people on time.
Okay.
So with these rules, we'll go ahead and make these minor tweaks to them, and we'll bring them back on a future agenda for formal adoption. So
Okay.
thanks
Thank
for your
you.
time on that.
Truly a really good job. I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Very, very well done, and I recognize all the time that went into this. It was no easy feat when you look at the original draft, what it was. All right, so we're moving into items initiated by the commission. And we're looking for a verbal report on the 2018 League of California Cities Planning Commissioners Academy. Who would like to start on that?
Well, that would be Commissioner Sayason and Commissioner Gooding were there as well as me, but I will yield to my my commissioners, and if anything to add, I'll tag in on the end.
Commissioner Sayason, you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, it was, I think, a great experience overall. I think the most helpful thing was just to be able to network and speak with other commissioners from the various cities and staff, and I think the two biggest takeaways that I got from it. There was just so many sessions and so many information that was given to you. So some of it kind of got lost, but I think what stuck with me the most was one, just on the interactions between staff and the commissioners and the applicant. And, I think just hearing from others and pitfalls that they went through, I think it was helpful for me to learn that, for example, when we're having our meetings, I think it's very important for us to be as prepared as possible, and also to work with staff so that when we have our meetings, we know what's going to be discussed, and there's no surprises. So if we have questions, we know what the agenda is, to ask staff beforehand. So I think that they're prepared to answer our questions, so that the meetings run more efficiently, so that the applicant, can know what to expect, and, the public, is also, they know what to expect, and that we're not going to be here talking about things that no one knew was going to come before the commission. So I think that's the most important thing, is to communicate any questions beforehand, and then once we're here at the meetings, to just, hear each other out, and to try to move things as smoothly as possible. Commissioner Gooding?
I agree with all that. It's interesting. So the website for League of California Cities archives all of the materials for all the presentations. So for those who couldn't make it but are interested, some of it was very, very helpful, especially the legislative update, and so a lot of materials. One of the major topic of the day is housing. And there are a lot of good reference materials and discussion about that as well. I recommend looking that up if you have time.
Okay.
Yeah, and on housing, I think that particular area covered about, 25% of our sessions, and I think it's something that they really pounded into our heads, that the state is very serious about it. There's definitely a shortfall in housing, and obviously all the various cities, they have their issues. They want to maintain local control the way we do, but I think we also need to prepare for what's coming. Some of the stats that they read off to us at one of the sessions I attended, so just to throw it out. So there's 38 million people in California, 16 million jobs, and 14 million housing units. So every year, California builds about 125,000 housing units. We need twice that to make up for our housing shortage. So last year, there were over 100 state bills alone dealing with housing, of which 15 were signed into law by Governor Brown. So what the presenters were saying, that's pretty much going to be the trend that we're going to see this year, that there's going to be a lot more bills introduced in housing, and I think it's a matter that's going to be something that we're all going to have to deal with and expect and somewhat prepare for. So,
Commissioner Gooding, any other?
No, agreed.
No? Okay. John, would you like to make some comments?
I would agree that housing was certainly the top of mind issue. I think maybe for the new commissioners too, something that's more procedural, realize that we're all, what we do is kind of a function or a creature of the state of California, but there are all sorts of ways of how commissions operate. You'll hear people who, I think that's always interesting, that there's no necessarily the right way. There's there's the city's way of doing things as a commission and as how you interact with the council and other things, and there is certainly some latitude, and I think as a body over time, as you kind of grow into your roles and the idea of how this relationship, how we deal with you, how the staff, the commission, and the council all work together, I think are all things that you're very mindful and respectful of how things have done here, and I think that's important. But there is not necessarily the right way. Things sometimes, changing conditions and changing circumstances may require different approaches and thought processes, and I think that you want to stay open to that as a body in terms of how. And again, I don't want to be in a position where I'm constraining you, and my default may be, well, that's the way we've always done this, or that doesn't necessarily mean that's the right way or the best way at this point. And so I think you're always welcome, and I encourage you to kind of think a little bit about not just the way things have been done, or maybe how they could be done or should be done, with a foot, and I going forward with a foot maybe in the past. In terms of some of these housing issues, I think they'll play out. We will be coming back to the commission as a whole with some amendments to our zoning regulations to be more reflective of some of the legislation that passed last year. We had a workshop before the 3 new members were seated. You probably remember that earlier this year when we talked about some of the housing legislation that was passed, and we could probably provide that summary to the entire commission, so you'll be it was really more of a 30,000 foot overview, but it might be useful because we will be getting into some code language that is fairly in pretty deep into the weeds in terms of our requirements and what we consider our legal obligations and how we best meet those in a way that puts the city in the best legal position we need to be. And then some of this housing issues will play out longer term, probably within the term of most of even if the terms you're appointed to, because it seems like just yesterday we did a housing element, because a housing element is one element of the general plan that we have to regularly update on an 8-year cycle. Sooner than I would like to think, we'll be ready to do that again. And again, what you're going to find for commissioners the challenge with the housing element here is to find adequate sites, because our projected growth that the state tends to impose on us based on our employment and other considerations, location within the inner bay and proximity to jobs and other, where we're perceived to be a very desirable location for housing, may be true, but as you all are aware, we're fairly constrained in locations where we can actually accommodate housing. So the challenge for us in these housing elements is always to identify sites, and that's to date has been the city's obligation, not to make sure that housing gets built, but to identify sites that are available for housing. The rules of the game are going to be changing and becoming increasingly strict. We're going to be now, in the future, judged not just by our ability to accommodate housing, but for the market and the private sector's actual performance in producing housing. It's not going to be so much, okay, you have enough land zoned for housing. They're going to start looking at, well, you have this zoned land, but of the 412 units you needed to have built in your jurisdiction, only 17 got built, or only 290 got built, or whatever. But there's going to be more of an obligation on the city to, and we're in that difficult position because we're not building housing, but we're going to be now, as a city, sort of bearing the burden of whether the market and the private sector produces housing, which is going to be, it's kind of a big shift in sort of housing law and accountability, and is very much a challenge. The other issue that has come up, there's already legislation that says, we have what's called a regional housing needs allocation, and you have to meet, and the problem with the city with Brisbane typically is not so much the market rate. There's usually enough land and sites to meet our market rate needs, but it's our lower and moderate income. And we're now going to be obligated to zone not for all of our number of low and mod units, but 200% of our. So if we have an obligation for 150 low mod units, we're going to have to zone for 300 units low mod. So things are changing even in terms of, so the housing element is often been a kind of a contentious issue for the commission. Nothing is going to be on your sort of the front of your plate. It'll be 18 months to 2 years out before you're really going to have to get your feet wet. But I think that's this whole housing emphasis in Sacramento is going to play out on this body and on staff and on the community as a whole in ways we probably don't fully understand right now.
So may I ask, are you saying that the RENA numbers that I believe right now, the current period goes through, is it 2022?
Mm-hmm.
So are you saying that they could potentially revise those in advance of that date?
No, they won't. They won't change this, but really to get a housing element adopted by 2022, that probably starts in about 2020.
Mm-hmm.
Is really when this process will start, and and the rules in terms of what we're actually going to be having to do are going to be dramatically different.
It's quite a departure to think of a city's obligation to make sure that development is actually implemented, considering that's private funding, private development, not city funding. Are they trying to suggest that the cities are supposed to fund some of the housing?
Well, that was one of the pieces of legislation. I mean, there were in the bills that were passed last year, I think we probably spent our time emphasizing the regulatory side. There were some modest funding proposals. There's a real estate fee that's imposed that's going to generate some waterfall, fairly limited amount of funding for housing. They also predict that there may be some redevelopment-like tools that get approved in the state of California over the next couple of years that will have a very heavy housing emphasis, and maybe TOD, those kind of goals that the state has in terms of reducing greenhouse gases and vehicle trips and providing housing in proximity to jobs. So there'll probably be more of a targeted, I think is what they say, more of a targeted redevelopment for funding sources. But yeah, I mean, that is the problem. When redevelopment went away, that was a large pool of funding for housing that local jurisdictions no longer have. There are a lot of cities are doing other mechanisms or means to try to create funding. You can adopt certain kind of fees on new development that relate to pay for the housing, for subsidized housing. I think Brisbane, the challenge is maybe, like most cities, financial, but also just physical areas that can be developed in an efficient manner. As we know, we have a lot of smaller infill sites which are not great. They're not really efficient to develop on a cost basis, or you have sites that are very challenged because of topography or soils conditions or what have you. And so we just don't have a great pool of available sites to readily invest in, even if the city had the funds and the ability.
I've heard also that there are certain state legislators who are pushing to bring back redevelopment agencies, and that may be a topic we'll see this year in Sacramento. You mentioned the workshop that we had a couple months ago for the commissioners about ongoing state legislation, and I shouldn't speak for Commissioner Sayasan, but it was so helpful and it wasn't very long. I would really like to see you bring that back and run it again, and I'd sit through it a second time if you wouldn't mind, because it was very helpful, and it really gives you some things to think about going forward.
Yeah, I think we would do that. I think we could do that. I think we might want to add at least.
Well, I mean, I would just note it is online. So it was the February 27th meeting. So it's accessible now if you want to spend your free time at home watching old videos. But yes, there are new bills that we probably would want to run by you guys as well.
I think the other stage, because that was really to set the stage for some more focused Brisbane specific changes to law we need to make in our local ordinances. So I would probably want to leverage that, we could use that same sort of basic underpinning, but I'd like to kind of take it that next step of not having public hearings on code language, but dive a little deeper and make sure we start tying these sort of higher order state laws and requirements to what we actually do, and not try to resolve it in one meeting, but at least give all the commissioners a better sense of what's really interesting in the abstract, what's required, but what do we do and how we do business, and how will that be impacted by these changes, and what changes are we going to have to make to our procedures to comply more fully.
So at one time also in the past meetings, you brought up a topic of holding some workshops for commissioners just to explain the workings of zoning and handling certain projects. Is that something that we should expect upcoming, or even would it be potentially possible to make that ongoing, where we have, instead of trying to do it all in one or two meetings, to just do here and there, add it to an agenda, certain topics. That way we could just absorb it and it wouldn't be as much of a burden on staff.
I think that's a great idea. We've talked about, I think there are logical bites of this. You know, we could do some work on general plan. We can do something on the zoning. We could do something on the city attorney with some of the legal, requirements, whether they be conflict, whether they be findings, et cetera. So we were actually talking in our staff meeting today about sort of starting to parse this out and come up with a kind of a list of a number of workshops that we could probably take a first crack at. But certainly the other thing is we're looking for is commission input if there's certain areas. I know a lot of you are a little new, you don't really know necessarily what you don't know, and I understand that can be a little challenging, but certainly if there are areas based on, past practice or what you know about the law or procedures we've had to date, if there are particular issues that are of top of mind to you that you'd like to see kind of spend some time on, that would be real helpful for us to focus our efforts. We would probably, I think, again, start at a higher order, the general plan, then some of the zoning, and then some of the things that get into the legal requirements for findings, and that will get into some of the changes we need to make to the city ordinances to comply with the state housing acts. So that's kind of how I see it laying out, probably over, we hadn't talked about it, but I could see 4 or 5 meetings, and then a meeting where the city attorney can capture him to do maybe a wide variety of different topics at one meeting.
Even perhaps if you could look at last year, certain things like the general plan amendments and the rezoning, and just bring everyone else back up to date on what was covered briefly and why that was done. That might just be, not in great depth, but just something to kind of understand. That's the table setting for where we're going forward now as well. Anyone want to address that as well? No?
Oh, that sounds good.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea, just to give as robust a background as possible to help get us up to speed.
And maybe this is a good time. Is there anything to commissioners that just is really confusing that you would like to see them address as one of the first items? Just procedurally or in terms of projects?
So what I was going to do is I was going to actually review the meeting that you guys had previously spoken about, the February 27th meeting, review what was stated, and then if I have questions, maybe address those questions after I view that in its entirety.
Yeah. If you'd want to email any questions either on that specific presentation or ideas for future trainings and workshops, definitely email them to me or Alberto, who communicates with you about packets.
I think just one suggestion I would have to consider is that when we consider projects, I think what's hardest as being a new commissioner is understanding what the options are available to commissioners in terms of an action. It's not just an approval or a denial or continuing to another meeting, but when things are approved, what options we have to insert with that motion for approval. That would be helpful. Anyone else? No? Okay. I will entertain a motion for adjournment.
I move to adjourn the meeting.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye.